It was supposed to be a quiet night. Lucas and I were walking along the abandoned trails, unhurried, enveloped by the mist that embraced the rusty tracks. The silence around us was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the damp ground. Something about that place always drew me in, as if I were standing on the edge of everything. It was my refuge, a space where I could escape the chaos of the city, the expectations that suffocated me. In the solitude of that desolate scene, I felt at peace. Maybe it was the sense of freedom or the fact that we were far from everything, isolated, without rules, without judgment. I like to think that the space around me was mine, without barriers to limit me. Every visit to that abandoned track was an opportunity to create, to leave my mark. The art I made in these places was more than graffiti. It was a silent manifesto against monotony, a way to rebel against a world that always tried to cage me. However, that night, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if the darkness itself had weight. Lucas was quiet beside me as usual. He enjoyed the adventures but wasn't into graffiti like I was. His interests were different, but he always came along with that calm and distant demeanor. While he rolled another joint, I stared at the train tracks in front of us, like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. The train line looked perfect, untouched, without any signs of intervention. It was as if it had been waiting for me. My heart raced with anticipation. There was something powerful about transforming forgotten spaces with my art, as if each stroke was a small revolution. But that night, even as I prepared myself, a strange feeling began to grow inside me. Something was off. The trees around us whispered softly in the breeze, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. This was my place, and normally the solitude was comforting. Yet this time, the feeling of isolation disturbed me. I began to paint, trying to focus on the work in front of me. The sound of the spray can was familiar, almost soothing. Every line I drew was a way to regain control, an attempt to ignore the unease building inside me. Minutes passed and my strokes started to take shape. Each line, each color, was an extension of who I was, a mark left on the world. Everything seemed to be flowing smoothly until the first sound broke the silence. A distant metallic clang echoed through the humid air. My eyes immediately darted to Lucas, who remained silent, but his eyes were wide open now. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though a wave of panic was already rising. Lucas just nodded, his eyes fixed on some point on the horizon. Alert. The sound echoed in our minds like a warning, a sign that we were not alone. We stood still for a few seconds, listening for any other noise. The silence returned, but it was no longer comforting. Now it was oppressive. What had that sound been? I tried to convince myself it was just the wind moving some rusted piece of metal, maybe an old train car shifting in the breeze. I went back to my work, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something or someone was watching us. The second sound came louder, and this time there was no doubt. It was the unmistakable sound of a can being kicked. A wave of tension shot through my body like an electric shock. I looked around, feeling the panic rise. One of my spray cans had been moved. But by whom? Lucas quickly approached, fear now clearly written on his face. "Man, what's going on?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I had no answers. I just knew something was wrong. And then the scream. A furious human scream echoed from behind the train cars. "You shouldn't be here." The voice reverberated through the thick air, filling the space between us with a sense of dread. We were frozen for a second, unable to react, until another sound propelled us into action. A gunshot. The shot pierced the air, and the sound of the light rain that had begun to fall mingled with the chaos in our minds. There was no time to think. We ran as fast as our bodies allowed, the wet tracks turning each step into a desperate struggle. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who or what was chasing us. When we finally reached the road, fear was still chasing us, though no one was visibly behind us anymore. Lucas was pale, his hands shaking uncontrollably. We got into the car, the silence between us as heavy as the questions hanging in the air. What had just happened? Who was that voice, and why were we being chased? Days passed, but the feeling of danger never left me. The memory of that night haunted me constantly. Lucas didn't want to talk about it anymore, insisting we should just leave it behind, that we were lucky to have escaped. But something in me couldn't let it go. I needed answers. I went back to the place alone, this time during the day. I thought that in the daylight, the fear would lessen, that I could look at the train cars rationally and find a logical explanation for what had happened. But when I arrived, I realized something was still wrong. The rusted train remained motionless, like a corroded metal specter. The smell of abandonment and rust was strong, but there was something else, something I couldn't identify. As I approached the cars, my heart sank. My artwork had been destroyed. The vibrant colors and lines I had created were covered with crude smears of red paint, splashed carelessly, as if someone wanted to erase any trace of my presence there. And then I saw it. The door to one of the train cars was ajar. The smell of bleach hit me hard, an almost nauseating wave. Something was definitely wrong. My instincts told me to leave, but curiosity and the need to understand what had happened pushed me to go inside. The interior of the car looked like something out of a nightmare. In the center, an old, simple chair was surrounded by chains and ropes scattered on the floor. It was as if someone had been kept there, imprisoned. Fear surged back in full force, and my eyes scanned the space for any other sign that something terrible had happened. I was about to take a photo to document it when the metallic clang returned, this time much closer, much closer. My muscles tensed. I knew I needed to leave immediately. Survival instincts kicked in, and I ran without looking back. I left behind any thought of uncovering what was happening. At that moment, all that mattered was getting out. That night, lying in my bed, the memories haunted me. The scream, the gunshot, the metallic clang, everything replayed in my mind like a recurring nightmare. And the feeling that something was watching me didn't fade, not even when I closed my eyes. I knew the danger was still out there, lurking. 3 nights passed, and on the third, something changed. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound coming from the living room, a soft crack like something had fallen. My heart raced, and a sense of dread washed over me. I got up silently, trying not to make a sound, my bare feet on the cold floor, each step heightening the tension. When I reached the living room, my blood ran cold. On the floor, near the door, were 2 empty spray cans, the same cans I had discarded the night we fled. The marks on the labels were unmistakably mine. How had they ended up here? I looked around, searching for any sign of a break-in. Everything was intact. The windows were closed, the door locked. There was no explanation. And then the words came back to me like a distant memory. "You shouldn't have come back." The warning was clear. That night felt endless. The metallic clang echoed in my head, mingling with the sound of the gunshot that seemed never to cease. The next day I realized there was no more running. I needed answers. Returning to that train line was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. The following days were spent in a constant state of tension. The memory of the spray cans on my living room floor haunted me, just like the smell of bleach and the metallic clang that seemed to resonate in the back of my mind, even during the calmest hours of the day. Fear had seeped into my life silently and relentlessly, and I knew somehow that it wasn't over yet. No matter how hard I tried to live normally, something kept pulling me back to that abandoned train line. A sense of incompleteness grew within me, as if the mystery wasn't just out there but inside me, demanding an answer I wasn't sure I was ready to find. On the 3rd night after the incident, I was on the brink of exhaustion, unable to sleep properly since the spray can event. I decided there was no more delaying it. I had to go back. This time, however, I would be prepared. I spent hours gathering everything I might need: powerful flashlights, ropes, a gun I barely knew how to use, and a camera, hoping to document whatever I encountered. It was foolish to think this would protect me from the unknown, but the sense of control comforted me. When night fell, I left my house, determined to face whatever was out there. The path to the train line felt longer than ever. The deserted streets of the city passed by in a blur, and the stillness of the world around me only amplified the fear pounding in my chest. The silence was a terrible companion. I was alone. Upon reaching the tracks, the fog seemed even denser than last time. The moon was barely visible in the sky, obscured by heavy clouds and the moisture that filled the air. The sound of my footsteps echoed strangely, almost as if the ground around me was absorbing everything, silencing the environment. As I approached the train cars, the familiar weight of oppression returned. The air was thicker, every breath felt heavy, and the sensation of being watched was almost tangible. Something was there with me. I pointed my flashlight at the old chair inside the train car, the place where it had all begun. The chains were still on the floor, but this time there was something different. Small drag marks on the ground, as if something or someone had been moved recently. The smell of bleach persisted, but now it was mixed with an even more intense odor, something that made me recoil for a moment. The acrid scent of fresh blood. My heart raced, and with trembling hands, I pointed the camera at the ground, trying to capture an image of the dark stains glistening under the flashlight. But before I could react, the metallic clang echoed again, much closer than before. I froze. The sound seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the tracks and seeping into my bones. This time, however, it wasn't just the clang. There was something else. Soft, light footsteps, almost imperceptible. emerging from the fog around me. The sound echoed, first in the distance, then closer. Each step was a reminder of my vulnerability, of my exposure there, in the middle of nowhere. My eyes fixed on the direction of the sound, and that's when I saw her for the first time. A figure slowly emerged from the fog, small, fragile, like a child. She walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps, her body shrouded in a mist that seemed to move with her, as if it were part of her essence. My blood turned to ice. Her long, tangled hair partially covered her face, but it was impossible to ignore her eyes. They were large, black, deep, empty, yet at the same time full of something indescribable, something that evoked a primal fear, a terror that came from somewhere deep, beyond reason. She stopped a few meters from me, motionless. I wanted to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. The child's mouth opened, but no sound came out, only the void between us, filled by the metallic clang that echoed in the distance. The silence was oppressive, as if it was charged with meanings I couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, the child smiled, a crooked, strange smile that distorted her features in an unnatural way. It was as if something was wrong, as if the smile were a mistake, a grotesque imitation of what a human expression should be. Then, the clang returned, louder this time, and with it came a terrible sensation that I was being consumed by the very darkness around me. Fear overtook me. My muscles finally obeyed the most basic impulse of all: survival. I ran. My feet moved quickly over the tracks, but the fog seemed to envelop me, each step feeling heavier than the last. The clang continued to echo, now mixed with a constant buzzing in my head, like a relentless reminder that something was hunting me. When I finally reached the road, the relief I expected to feel never came. The fear was still there, like an invisible weight on my shoulders. I looked back, expecting to see the figure in the fog, but there was nothing. Even so, the terror stayed with me. I knew I wasn't alone. In the nights that followed, the psychological chase only worsened. The metallic clang returned at the most unexpected moments, reverberating in my mind, intertwined with the memories of that child. Every shadow seemed to have a life of its own. Every nighttime sound brought back the sensation that I was being watched, followed by something invisible. Even during the day, the feeling wouldn't leave me. I knew it wasn't over. There was something much bigger behind everything that had happened on that train line. The child, the scream, the gunshot, the spray cans in my living room. It was all connected somehow. But how? That's when I started researching. I spent hours on the internet, digging through urban explorer forums, accounts of paranormal events, anything that might give me a clue about what I had witnessed. There were stories, fragments of urban legends, rumors about that train line. Many mentioned disappearances, accidents that were never explained, rumors that the place was cursed. And then, a name appeared: the Child of the Fog, a recurring rumor in obscure forums, mentioning sightings of a child in abandoned and forgotten places. According to the accounts, she appeared to those who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. She appeared as a warning, a sign that whoever saw her had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And there was always a message: you shouldn't be here. Those words echoed in my mind, exactly like the voice we heard that night. The dread I felt in that moment returned with full force. The child was real, or at least something real was using her as a manifestation. But what did she want? And why me? In the days that followed, fear turned into a sort of obsession. I spent more time reading about the place, connecting stories and legends. Something was trapped on that train line, and I needed to understand what it was. Lucas, despite everything, didn't share this obsession. He distanced himself from me, saying I was being paranoid, that I needed to stop thinking about it. He barely talked about the incident, always trying to convince me that we had just escaped some crazy person with a gun, nothing more. But I knew it was more than that. I decided I had to go back one last time, this time more prepared and more determined than ever. If I was going to face the unknown, it would be head on. When the chosen night arrived, the fog seemed even denser than before. Each step toward the tracks brought me closer to what I both feared and longed for at the same time. I knew I was about to cross a point of no return, but curiosity and the need for answers drove me forward. The train cars were there, unmoving, like guardians of a secret I still didn't understand. The chair, the chains, the smell of bleach, everything was in the same place, but the air felt different. A presence, stronger, more oppressive, hung around me. As I approached the train car, a different sound echoed. It was no longer the distant metallic clang. It was closer, heavier, as if something was moving between the cars. I gripped the flashlight and the gun tightly, my eyes scanning the area around me. I knew I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the darkness seemed to come alive. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, and the clang returned, this time louder, more insistent. My muscles tensed, and adrenaline surged through my body like an electric shock. Something was there with me. When I turned toward the entrance of the train car, I saw a scene that froze the blood in my veins. It was no longer just one child. Several figures emerged from the fog, small, with the same distorted faces, their black eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me step back. Now, they weren't just watching me. They were approaching. The figures emerging from the fog surrounded me from all sides. Small, with twisted features, their black, empty eyes stared at me with a gaze that made my skin crawl. There was no more escape. My mind was in chaos. I needed to think, but the fear paralyzed me. The flashlight shook in my hands, the beam flickering from side to side, catching only glimpses of the shadows closing in. Each step they took echoed softly, almost hypnotically. The metallic clang that accompanied each movement filled me with a sense of deep dread. The child I had seen the first time was there again, leading the group. Her black eyes pierced my soul, and that distorted smile reappeared on her pale face. It was the smile of something that didn't understand what it meant to be human. There was no joy in it, only a grotesque imitation of emotion. She approached until she was just a few meters from me, and my mind screamed for me to do something, anything, but my body was frozen. The darkness around me seemed to have its own life, suffocating, wrapping around me like a physical presence. My instinct screamed that this wasn't just a hallucination or a nightmare. Then the child spoke again, the same phrase that had echoed in my mind since the first night. "You shouldn't have come back." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. but the power contained in those words reverberated through my body, as if an invisible force was trying to bring me to my knees. Those words weren't just a warning, they were a sentence. I drew the gun with trembling hands. I didn't want to use it. I didn't even know what I was facing, but something told me I would need any advantage possible to escape. Pointing it at the figure in front of me, I tried to speak, but my voice came out weak, suffocated by terror. "Who? What are you?" I managed to murmur, barely believing I was trying to communicate with whatever this was. The child didn't respond. Her black eyes stayed fixed on me, and her smile slowly disappeared, replaced by an expression of something that resembled anger, but in a distorted, almost inhuman way. The other beings around her began to move as well, slowly, like shadows gliding across the ground, their silhouettes warped by the fog. My breathing became erratic. The metallic clang intensified, mixed with the soft, continuous sound of footsteps coming from all directions. They were closing in on me. My body screamed to run, but my legs were paralyzed. I knew that if I didn't act, this would end horribly. Then, without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the empty tracks, reverberating like an explosion that seemed to shake the fog around me. The child's figure fell back, and for a brief moment, I felt a terrible relief, as if I had accomplished something, anything. But then, the impossible happened. The child stood up, slowly, as if nothing had happened. The hole in her chest didn't bleed. Instead, the darkness around her seemed to consume the wound, as if it were being absorbed. Her black eyes didn't blink. She looked directly at me, and I realized how futile it was to face her with something as mundane as a gun. She took another step toward me, and I took a trembling step back. My heart was racing, and everything around me seemed to be spinning. The other figures were moving closer too, their suffocating presence making the air even heavier. I was surrounded by something that couldn't be explained or fought. That's when I realized they weren't real in the traditional sense. They were manifestations of something deeper, something that inhabited this place, perhaps long before I or anyone else had ever stepped foot here. That train line was cursed, and I had crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed. Trying to stay calm, I took a few steps back, never taking my eyes off the figures in front of me. But suddenly, something grabbed my ankle. A shiver ran down my spine, and when I looked down, I saw a pale hand rising from the ground, gripping my leg with impossible strength. That touch was icy, as if it had been pulled from death itself. I tried to free myself, but it was useless. The child tilted her head, still watching me with that empty gaze, as if waiting to see what I would do next. It was as if she were enjoying my despair. In a final act of desperation, I let out a muffled scream and kicked the hand holding me. I felt the cold grip loosen for a brief moment, just enough for me to fall backward, but free. Without a second thought, I got up and ran. I ran with all the strength my body had, my feet pounding heavily on the wet iron tracks, the useless gun still in my hand. The metallic clang didn't stop, echoing like a terrible warning that there was no escape. The fog around me seemed to come alive, surrounding me, distorting sound and vision, turning the world into a blur of shadows and whispers. I knew this wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. I was being hunted. When I finally reached the road, The buzzing in my ears was almost unbearable. I was sweaty, breathless, my mind on the verge of collapse. But I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I would lose the last shred of sanity I had. The darkness was following me. It was with me, even if I couldn't see it. I drove in silence, my hands still trembling, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, expecting at any moment to see the child, or whatever that was, appear again. The road seemed endless, and the invisible weight of fear crushed me. Every shadow cast by the headlights was a reminder of what I had encountered. What were these things? Why were they tied to me? And why did it now feel impossible to escape? In the days that followed, my life was consumed by paralyzing fear. I avoided leaving the house, and every small sound or movement made me think they were near. The children of the fog. They were more than a legend, more than an urban myth. They were real, and now they were a part of my life in a way I couldn't understand or control. I spent hours, days, trying to find answers. I delved even deeper into forums, reports, and old stories about that train line. I started to uncover patterns, disappearances, unsolved deaths, accidents that seemed to be hushed up by local authorities. The train line was stained with blood and pain, a place where time and space seemed to fold in on themselves, creating rifts where the impossible happened. And then I found the name, the Fog Guardian. What once seemed like just a legend became clearer as I read more accounts from people who had gone through similar experiences. That child wasn't alone. She was part of something bigger, an ancient force that inhabited forgotten places, the ruins where humanity had given up. The Guardian was an entity that existed in the shadows of history. It manifested through the fog, luring lost souls and punishing those who dared to cross into its domain. That train line was just one of many places where it reigned, and I had become its target by returning, defying the warning it had given me. Now, as I write this, I know my time is running out. The shadows around me are moving again. The metallic clang has returned, this time inside my own home. Each night is shorter, and the buzzing in my ears is louder. I know he is getting closer. The Guardian does not forget, does not forgive, and I shouldn't have come back.